So to create the p-scale attribute, since I don't want each bubble to be the exact same size, I will use an attribute randomize node. So press tab and look for the attribute randomize. So make sure to connect it underneath the kill percentage node. And first of all, what we need to do is to change the attribute name to p-scale. And one very important thing that we need to do is, by default, this node will use the ptnum attribute to create the randomization. So if you go to options, here you will find the seed attribute. And notice how we can use the ID of each particle to create this randomization. So click on seed attribute. The default ID is fine. So now let's go back to distribution. And since the p-scale attribute is a float, we can change the dimensions to 1. So currently all we need to do is change the minimum and maximum values. So let's try using a maximum of 0.01. So here you can see some of the bubbles are larger than others. We can even go lower than this. Let's try with 0.0025. And I think for the large bubbles, that's fine. For the minimum value, we can try with 0.001. And I think this can work. So one more thing, if you select the sphere, you will notice that the default type is a primitive. I'm going to change this to polygon. One more thing, if you have a huge amount of bubbles, you can select the copy to points node and click on pack and instance. So this will create packed objects, which could greatly increase the performance of your scene in case of a huge amount of copies. So that would be it in terms of the geometry. Let's create a null just below our copy to point. Let's connect it, change its color to black, and call it out ink bubbles. Okay, so in order to render these bubbles, we need to create a material. So let's go to the material context. Let's create a principled shader. Let's call it bubble material or material bubbles. And in this case, we won't need a color for the bubbles, so we can reduce the albedo value to 0. For the bubbles, we will rely on the transparency and reflectivity of the material. So on the specular, let's change the roughness to 0.05. Also, let's scroll down to the transparency and let's increase the transparency to 1. And that should be all for this material. So let's now assign it to the bubbles geometry. We can copy this material, go back to the object context, and here on the ink bubbles geometry, under the render tab, paste this material. So now we should be able to render these bubbles. Now, before we do that, there's something very important that we need to take into consideration. We already rendered the ink volume separately. Now, we need to do the same thing. We need to render the bubbles by themselves, but we will need to create a holdout mat for these bubbles. And this means we will need to hide the bubbles when they are behind or in this volume. So I'm going to show you how we can do this. First of all, let's go to our out context. And we can copy this mantra node that we already have. So you can Alt, click and drag to create a copy of the node. And we're going to call this node ink bubbles. So the render camera would be the same as for the ink. Of course, we have the same frame range, but something very important that we're going to change here under the Objects tab is we're only going to use the bubbles as visible geometry. So let's delete this asterisk for the candidate objects. What this asterisk is saying, render everything that's visible in the scene. So I'm going to delete this one and force to render only the bubbles. So here on this button to the right, we can click and select only the bubbles. And now here under the forced matte, I'm going to select my ink volume. So let's try rendering one frame and see what we get. So let's go to the render view. Make sure to select the ink bubbles mantra node. Also make sure to render through the camera view and click the render button. Okay, so we have something very interesting happening. We have the very bright bubbles being lit by these two very bright lights that we have. And here in the middle, we have some purple or pink bubbles that are refracting the ink. Now notice some parts are completely hiding the bubbles, and this is due to the matte that we're creating with the ink volume. So let's try this. I will remove the matte. So let's just delete that text and press enter. So these are the bubbles rendered by themselves. Notice how most of them are white because they're either reflecting or refracting these very bright lights. So let's again create our matte. Just type here ink, or you can always select the ink volume from this list. And now we are ready to render these bubbles, and by the time we composite them on top of the ink, they will look like if they were integrated or interacting with the volume as expected. So make sure to select your mantra node. Also make sure that the frame range is the entire animation. And now you can press in the render to disk button.